Shane. That was a fantastic distillation of an incredible life in just a few moments. And indeed, of 20 years research. And I think we can only hope that Honor will decide to take that further and perhaps publish something on it. The person with the terrible job of having to follow that is Mary Plunkett. Mary is a graphic designer, and she is a printmaker, specialises in letterpress printing. She designs and prints her own work, in particular book arts, and she enjoys indeed collaborating with other artists, writers and designers. Her work is in many, many collections. She's very collectible. She's in the National Library of Ireland, Trinity College Rare Books, National Irish Visual Arts Library, the British Library, and indeed the Boston College Library. Now, after completing a Master's in Visual Communication at Distillers Press at the National College of Art and Design in 2011, and winning Print of the Year at the Irish Print Awards for her Master's Project Night Prayer. She spent a year in that college as designer in residence 2012 to 2013. She's a member of Graphic Studio Dublin and regularly works with the National Print Museum, most recently as advisor for the European-funded project Creative Makers, and as training manager for a skills transfer project. 2015 marked the launch of her personal imprint, the Belgrade Private Press, based at a workshop in Dublin. She is the great granddaughter of George Noble Plunkett. So I'll give you Mary Plunkett.
So this is based on my 2002 undergraduate thesis, George Noble Plunkett and his role in the arts, and an article of the same name published in 2004 in Thoughtline 7, an anthology of research. Count Plunkett was involved in so many artistic, literary and cultural organisations and associations that when I first presented the list to my supervisor, Dr. Niamh O'Sullivan, we agreed I'd have to select just a few on which to focus my thesis. So you probably can't read that, it's a bit too small, but this is just some of the places where he worked or he was involved in as membership or director. 4 of his achievements were selected from this long list, and today I'll discuss only 3. The Society for the Preservation of the Irish Language, Hibernia, a monthly popular review, and his time as director of the then Dublin Museum of Science and Art. So at the age of 6, George Noble Plunkett was sent to the Jesuit school in Nice. During these 6 years in Nice and San Remo, he sowed the seeds of his lifelong love of Italian painting. On his return to Dublin, he attended the Oblak Fathers School in Upper Street, where he won prizes for Irish history. By the time he entered Clongowes College in 1867, he had an enthusiasm for the national movement as articulated in his diary of 1866, 67 and 68, now in the National Library. He called it a notebook of an eccentric philosopher, and in it he kept newspaper clippings of poetry, his theories on mesmerism, and the minutes of meetings of the literary society called Galathmusos, from the Greek galathma, meaning a laugh, and muthos, meaning a tale. This society consisted of a group of friends who met regularly to discuss legends, stories, and the poetry of Irish, English, Greek, and Latin poets. They also presented lectures to each other on chemistry, art, politics, and geography. Plunkett showed his knowledge of painting, engraving, drawing, and tinting. He explained how each was carried out and showed the powers and effect of each. He talked about Michelangelo, James Barry, and Rembrandt. He also defended the Irish nation, attacking her enemies, and justified her right to revolution as long as misrule is practiced upon her. He was then 16 years old. In Clongowes, his interests were in literature and modern languages, and when he left the college in 1869, he was already writing for the national papers such as The Nation and The Shamrock. In 1870, he travelled throughout France, Italy, Austria and Germany, laying the foundation of his extensive and intimate knowledge of art. Thereafter, he travelled to Italy regularly, studying Renaissance painting, and for his 21st birthday, using the £100 he'd been gifted, he purchased a painting of the Adoration of the Magi, which at one point was believed to be by Rubens. He was greatly interested in literature, art and journalism, and as a wealthy young bachelor, he had the means to immerse himself in the subjects he enjoyed, collecting books, manuscripts and paintings. However, his mother wished him to continue his studies, and so he entered Trinity College in November 1872. He studied law, and he was eventually called to the bar in 1886. In Trinity, he became known in the college societies as an eloquent speaker with an unusual range of knowledge. He was made an honorary member of the University Philosophical Society, where he read papers on Italian art, English literature, and Irish industrial and social questions. He started several societies with his fellow students, Dr. Harold Littledale, and his Trinity chum, the poet George Green. At Trinity, Plunkett became a prizeman in the French language and literature and befriended, among others, Oscar Wilde, the author and playwright. They shared a common interest in literature and the Catholic faith, and they corresponded when Wilde moved to Oxford. Plunkett visited him there when his own law studies brought him to London. In London, he also saw a great deal of W.B. Yeats, who was struggling to find a support for his poetic talent. They also corresponded on literary matters, and some of these letters can be seen in the National Library. Plunkett was always interested in languages, and his patriotism made him all the more interested in the Irish language. While still at Trinity, Plunkett had presented an award for spoken Irish. The first recipient was Douglas Hyde, who went on to found the Gaelic League in 1893. As a young boy, Plunkett had been taught at home by an elderly man who had once been a hedge schoolmaster. They conversed in Greek and Latin, and it was from him that he learned what little Irish he had. His lack of knowledge, however, did not deter him from joining the Society for the Preservation of the Irish Language. This society, established in 1876, attempted to reintroduce Irish as a spoken language and so halt its decline. The society worked as an administrative body, which brought about changes in education and published books to aid the study of Irish, the object being to preserve and extend the use of Irish as a spoken language. The Society's first aim was the introduction of the Irish language to national schools. From the early 1870s, the question of the Irish language in national schools was surfacing at the annual conventions of the newly formed INTO, the Irish National Teachers Association. Some of its members prepared a memorial in 1874 with the aim of submitting it to the Commissioners of National Education. This was supported by the Royal Historical and Archaeological Society of Ireland. A year later, the Society for the Preservation of the Irish Language was formed. Like the Gaelic League that followed 16 years later, it was non-political and non-sectarian, and Catholics and Protestants worked well together in it. The Society was made up of committed idealists who undertook the day-to-day running of the Society, as well as academic, social and political men. They developed the INTO memorial idea, and in 1878 the Society succeeded in placing Irish on the National Schools programme as an optional extra subject with result feeds for a teacher. This was followed by another victory for the language when the O'Connor Donald, an Irish Party Member of Parliament and member of the Society, succeeded in submitting Irish as a subject under the Intermediate Board of Education. It was listed as a philological subject and called Celtic. George Noble Plunkett is listed as a member in the first report of the Society in 1798. The following year he was elected to the Council, and he was amongst those present at the first Irish Language Congress in 1882. In 1894 he acted as the Society's delegate at the Teachers' Conference. In amongst these years he became a Vice President and Honorary Treasurer in 1887, was elected to the Publications Committee in 1893, and elected President of the Society, where he remained for many years, from 1908. The Society for the Preservation of the Irish Language held Irish classes in its early days in number 9 Kildare Street, but its primary work was the publication of Irish texts. Their first book was the first Irish book on Creidlar Gaeilge in 1878, prior to which there was no cheap elementary book for the teaching of the Irish language. While grammar books were available, none were sufficiently simple or properly graduated enough for the uneducated or the young. In the preface to the book itself, it was declared that the Society intended to publish a series of books in which every effort will be made to render the acquisition of our language as easy as possible. Priced at 2p, it was intended to be read and understood by oneself or with the aid of an Irish speaker. The second and third Irish books followed, costing 4p and 6p respectively, building on the Irish learned in the previous books. The Society went on to produce the Irish headline copybook, The Pursuit of Diarmuid and Grania, and The Fate of the Children of Eir, amongst others. Each book was a mixture of Irish and English, as were the meetings of the Society itself. This is just Count Plunkett's name highlighted in the members of council and under the honorary treasurers. In 1893, the Gaelic League was founded and effectively took over the preservation work of the Society, setting up clubs all over the country, publishing books, and in 1910 introducing Irish as an essential subject for entrance into the National University. The Gaelic League proved to be much more successful, as the Preservation Society lacked the dynamism to convert the adult population to the gospel of an Irish Ireland. Although the Society for the Preservation of the Irish Language continued to publish textbooks and support the education of Irish throughout the country, it was not what it used to be, as could be seen in the minutes of the 1932 council meeting. By this time, the council consisted essentially of the president, Count Plunkett, the secretary, J.J. O'Kelly, and 2 or 3 other members who met at Count Plunkett's house in Elgin Road. Count Plunkett remained president of the society until the 1940s, when it must be assumed that the society came to an end, as there is no record of any meeting after 1941. So Plunkett began writing for the Shamrock and the Nation while still at school. The Shamrock was described as the most popular humorous paper that has appeared in Ireland and certainly the longest lived. This national weekly journal consisted of articles on Irish history, literature and arts, and lasted from 1866 until 1912, when it was absorbed by the British. The Nation was also a national weekly journal, started by Charles Gavin Duffy, Thomas Davis and John Blake Dillon in 1842. This paper set a high professional standard in content and presentation, advocated Irish independence, and had extensive circulation in Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Waterford and Belfast, as well as Liverpool, Manchester and London. Described in the Waterloo Dictionary of Papers of Newspapers and Periodicals as one of the most influential periodicals ever published in Ireland, it was the organ of the Young Ireland movement. It was also said of it that the contemporary European strands of cultural nationalism, separatism, liberalism, and a physical force behind philosophy meet in the Nation. At a time when other major papers had circulations of 2,000 or 3,000, the Nation by December 1843 had achieved a circulation of some 10,700 copies. While newspapers were expensive and circulation small, their message reached a much larger audience than these numbers indicate due to the practice of reading aloud and the use of reading rooms. Plunkett wrote on current affairs for these papers and kept his interest in writing alive when he studied law at Trinity, publishing a book of poetry in 1877 and a booklet on the early life of Henry Grattan in 1878. Plunkett was a devout Catholic and expressed his religious and patriotic feelings in his poetry, writing on his love of God and Ireland. His book of poetry, God's Chosen Festival and Other Poems, was well received both in Ireland and England. At home, the Nation described it as a tiny and pretty little volume, warm with the fervour of religious feeling, of domestic affection and of patriotic sentiments. While in England, Mayfair wrote, "Religious and national enthusiasms are here tempered by culture and presented in the graceful form which best befits them." And Notes and Queries called it pious and patriotic, graceful and refined, pleasant to read, and also to remember. It was in 1882, at age 30, that Plunkett became editor of the newly founded Hibernia, a monthly popular review. This 16-page journal consisted of poetry, correspondence, fiction, and reviews. In the Waterloo Dictionary of Irish Newspapers and Periodicals, George Noble Plunkett is listed as the editor, proprietor, and publisher of the magazine. Hibernia was released at the beginning of each month, from January 1882 to July 1883, when its short run came to an end. The journal was run by young Irishmen of different parties and creeds, who kept clear of political controversies, but undertook the then impossible task of uniting the thinkers of Ireland in a common effort, dealing freely with Irish interests and aspirations. In the introductory editorial of the first issue, 2nd of January 1882, Plunkett expressed the aims of the conductors to extend popular cultivated opinion in Ireland and to make their paper useful in encouragement of Irish talent on a common ground from which political and sectarian discussion shall be excluded. They aimed to produce a periodical superior to what was already on the market. To secure this excellence, it will be their object to afford an opportunity to Irishmen to write in an Irish spirit for Irishmen, some of whom now find no means of directly communicating with their countrymen. The periodical professed a national sentiment and sought to express Irish opinions on the subject of social science, literature, art, music, native archaeological research, and similar matters of special and personal interest. The paper also aimed to review current literature, art, and music, as well as including translations from some foreign magazines and reviews representative of thought on the continent, a feature which has not been added as yet to any existing periodical. The introduction ends with a statement of the conductor's aim that Hibernia is meant to be a journal which will seek readers amongst every class in every part of the country. Regular contributors to the magazine included Dr. John Todhunter, the poet, playwright, physician and founder of the Irish Literary Society, Patrick Western Joyce LLD, the historian and member of the Society for the Preservation of the Irish Language, C.M. Ingleby, J. Howard Pentland AIB, Margaret Stokes, author of early Christian art in Ireland, and Catherine Tynan, a novelist and poet who made her debut in Hibernia. Other contributors included J.P. Mahaffey, the scholar, Edward Dowden, and the critic, and Anne McColgan, the botanist. These contributors expounded different creeds and political beliefs. P.W. Joyce and Plunkett, for example, were both supporters of the Irish language movement, while P.J. Mahaffey dismissed the idea that any worthwhile literature could exist in the Irish language. He also regarded nationalism as little better than provincialism, while Dowden disliked Irish nationalism and opposed home rule. There were very different views to those of the editor, but these debates had no place in the pages of Hibernia. In his editorials, Plunkett made comment on the poor state of technical instruction for women and on the lack of improvement in the National Library since it was taken over by the government 5 years previously. He praised the success of the Dublin Working Men's Clubs, discussed Irish industry and stated the proposed building on Kildare Street for the Museum of Science and Art. The articles he wrote for the magazine included For Prout and Thackeray, an unpublished relic in February 1882, More in the Sheridans, the unpublished letters of the poet in May of that year, and a tribute to Dennis Florence McCarthy in June. The journal did not just make reference to matters of Irish art and culture. Each month, John Todhunter wrote on the arts in London, and extracts from foreign periodicals were translated into the Irish. The review section dealt with books on a range of subjects from education to art and science, including a reissue of ballads and sonnets by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Music of Ireland by George Petrie, and Erin versus Irish and Catholic by the Reverend Matthew Russell. Plunkett also included some of his own poetry in the journal anonymously, many appear with just one letter as a signature. Other contributors to this include W.B. Yeats, whose work was signed with the Y. Hibernia was well received by the press of the 1880s. The Irish Times said of it, a periodical of this kind, interfering with no existing journal and having for its objects the cultivation and taste in a national spirit, will have strong claims on the Irish public. These opinions were shared by the Freeman's Journal, who hoped it would counteract the bad effects of the cheap English publications which abound throughout the country. As it was a uniquely Irish publication and was quite separate from the other national journals, it was welcomed by many periodicals and papers. The Northern Wing described the writing as piquant and sparkling. As a national journal devoted to the cause of culture and refinement, Hibernia deserves success. And the Kilkenny moderator declared that an amount of talent seems to be at the command of this new aspirant for a high place in Irish literature, which no undertaking of the kind in this country has been able to boast of for quite a long time. However popular it may have been, Hibernia's success lasted only a year and a half. The last issue was published in July 1883. The land war had made it impossible. And Father Matthew Russell, editor and founder of the Irish Monthly, complained that it was too good and large a paper for 6 months. Plunkett continued to contribute poetry and articles to the Irish Monthly, Nation, North and South, Flag of Ireland and Shamrock, amongst others. In 1894, Plunkett part-edited Charles O'Kelly's memoir of the Jacobite War in Ireland. In 1900, he published the standard biography on Senator Botticelli, which we have here today, courtesy of honour. His Pinelli in 1904 was followed by Architecture of Dublin, and in 1911, his revised edition of Margaret Stokes' early Christian art in Ireland. His poetry was also included in collections such as Songs and Ballads of Young Ireland in 1888, Dublin Verses by members of Chilton College in 1895, and Irish Love Songs edited by his co-worker in Hibernia, Catherine Tynan. In 1921, his second book of poetry, Arrows, was published, dealing with similar themes to that of God's Chosen Festival. Plunkett was not involved in the running of a journal again until 1937, when the Journal of the Academy of Christian Art was first published. Plunkett, now Count, was president of the Academy since its foundation in 1929. The journal reported on the proceedings of the Academy and printed the lectures delivered by its members, and though not editor, Count Plunkett was involved in its production until the Academy's demise in the 1940s. So in 1907, George Noble Plunkett was appointed director of the Dublin Museum of Science and Art. By this time, Plunkett was established as a cultural and political figure, welcomed by the Visitors' Board in 1908 as a gentleman already well and favourably known in Dublin for his scholarly and artistic accomplishments. He was on the Council of the Royal Irish Academy, Vice President of the National Literary Society. He had assisted the Arts and Crafts Society of Ireland as a judge and organiser since its foundation, and gave his judgment freely for the Royal Dublin Society's exhibition of applied art. As well as Irish societies, his travel abroad and his work in journalism, writing and arts administration gained him membership of societies from New York to Rome, Paris, London and Copenhagen. Plunkett was a distinguished author and antiquarian, described by the Irish book lover as honoured in the art world, not only as a critic of taste and discernment, but as the author of the standard work on Botticelli. He lectured on art and literature both here and abroad, some of his lectures being published in the periodicals of the day. Moreover, he was a Catholic, which was unusual for such a high appointment in what was then part of the British Museum. Elizabeth Crook says in her book on the history of the museums, with Count Plunkett's appointment, the identity of the museum began to shift. A year after his arrival, the museum was renamed the National Museum of Science and Art, Dublin. Plunkett argued that the title was more appropriate for the institution, having regard to its representative position in the capital as the Museum of Ireland and the Treasury of Celtic Antiques. He then set about rearranging the collection and redefining the purpose of the museum. The Irish Antiquities collection was given greater prominence in the new layout. Plunkett deemed these Irish objects of greater importance than the many foreign objects which had taken pride of place in the exhibitions of former directors. He believed that the visitors to the National Museum would hold in less consideration the foreign objects that the museum contains than the great historical series of Irish antiquities and the great illustrations of Irish arts and industries. Hence our work inclines largely towards a collection of things distinctly Irish, both ancient and modern. As director, he had to report to the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction for permission for travel expenses, for any increase in staff and for purchases. He also submitted annual reports, and financial estimates for the coming year had to be supplied to the department in respect of the National Museum, National Library, School of Art, Royal Botanical Gardens. His office was in Leicester House, which remained part of the museum complex until 1922, when it became the seat of Dáil Éireann. He corresponded with other institutions and exchanged catalogues with not only the Victorian Albert Museum, but also the Smithsonian Institute and United States National Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Biblioteca Hertziana in Rome. There were also exhibits and artefacts exchanged with other museums, and visiting lecturers were welcomed to Dublin. Attendance at the museum rose to over 250,000 people a year, though these numbers decreased with the oncoming war in 1914. Plunkett encouraged the use of the museum and its materials, especially by students and children. In 1910, a lecture room was opened where the students were allowed to handle the exhibits. Student numbers made a steady increase year by year, so much so that by 1916, no less than 3,590 students are reported as having studied the objects in the museum during the past year, and it is quite certain that many more visited the collections. To students from the School of Art, the director regularly offered 2 prizes for the best studies from objects in the museum. And he also prepared special exhibits for classes brought from the universities. He introduced a system of circulation cases, illustrating the diseases of plants and animals, processes of craft and manufacture, etc., for use in agricultural, technical and primary schools. It was also under his direction that the botanical section assisted popular education by the weekly examination and identification of specimens forwarded from the nature study classes of the National School. The shift Plunkett introduced to the museum by placing new emphasis on Irish exhibits reflected his own interest in art, antiquities and all things Irish. He was a member of the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland, an association instituted to preserve, examine and illustrate all the ancient monuments of the history, language, arts, manners and customs of the past as connected with Ireland. He became one of 12 vice presidents from 1906 to 1909, and in 1912 he was elected president of the RSAI, a post he held until 1916. As a testament to his standing, a portrait of Plunkett hung in the Society's room in Merrion Square. In 1911, he edited and revised Margaret Stokes' Early Christian Art in Ireland. He reissued the book, illustrated with 106 woodcuts, as one of the most necessary of our museum handbooks. Under his direction, Irish antiquities rose to new prominence, and a great effort was made to acquire any Irish collections and secure them for the museum. In 1914, the collection of Mr. Robert Day, the well-known Cork antiquary, was put on the market, and Plunkett went to London to examine them and make provision for the purchase of the principal items. Day's collection consisted of material illustrating the costumes and arms of the volunteers, dating from 1782. According to Plunkett, it was our duty to secure as many as possible of the important objects for the museum. Fortunately, a sum sufficient to obtain the needful collections was made available, and so the record of an important chapter in the history of Ireland is now permanently in the museum. In the same year, a find of a gold torque and 5 small gold axes from Stramford Lough came up for sale for £150. The museum and the Royal Irish Academy were both short of funds due to the day collection purchases, so Plunkett appealed to Lord Ivy to fund the acquisition. Professor R.A.S. McAllister described it as an acquisition of the greatest importance and wrote to Plunkett of his delight to hear the good news that the axes, etc., had been secured for the country. Plunkett also collected books, furniture, maps, musical instruments and works of art for his own personal collection. He filled houses with books, and his art collection grew to include a bust of Daniel O'Connell by John Hogan, King Lear weeping over the body of Cordelia by James Barry, a collection of original drawings by Doré, collections of architectural watercolours and sketches, and various portraits of Oliver Plunkett. He himself was the subject of portraits by the artists George Colley and Sean Sullivan. By attracting industry, students and children, encouraging their interaction with the museum, and by placing greater emphasis on the Irish collections, Plunkett was attempting to make the museum become truly national. He further justified the changes he implemented in his presidential address to the Museums Association in 1912. No community, however small and insignificant, considers itself properly provided for unless it has a museum. To my mind, a museum is more than a system, it is part of the national life. It is an expression of the national life and of the higher qualities of the people to whom it belongs. It is something which locally has struck its roots, and we may expect from it such flowers and fruits as belong to the nature of the place. His views were reported in the Freeman's Journal and the Irish Times, and so passed on to the public. The Irish Times declaring the Irish Antiquities collection in the museum not only a source of pride, but also a source of inspiration. This was a far cry from previous decades, when the Royal Irish Academy's collection had been stored in one room on the first floor, while replicas from South Kensington filled the central court. Plunkett's time as director came to an end in the wake of the Easter Rising in 1916. His sons Joseph, George and Jack fought in the GPO, while he oversaw the measures taken to protect the museum's collection. He arranged with the head attendant that extra men should be on night duty, and Liam Escogan, the officer in charge, took what measures seemed necessary to ensure the safety of all concerned. This was A. Had gold cases locked, B. Closed museum door, C. Ordered all attendants to go into private clothes, D. Explained to Sergeant of Police that if he thought it wise to withdraw his men, I would take responsibility. The director came into the museum and appeared satisfied. This was about 3 or 4 o'clock. Plunkett and his wife were arrested, and while he was an untried prisoner in Richmond Barracks, the department, sheltering itself behind the military, suspended the director. Count and Countess Plunkett were deported to Oxford, and T.W. Russell, making no explanation or inquiry, sent in his dismissal. The department felt there was an inherent danger in having a Republican sympathiser in a high civil service position. Similarly, his name was removed from the Who's Who's list, and the RDS asked him to resign, following a meeting that the Irish opinion described as a general mobilisation of reactionary fossildom, going on to describe Plunkett as a man who by his talents and his energy had done more for it, the RDS, than all those ornamental fossils combined. C.W. Steele became acting director of the museum in Plunkett's absence, and with the coming of the Free State in 1922, the museum was again renamed and became the National Museum of Ireland. Plunkett's name was returned to the Who's Who by the early 1920s, and he was also reinstated to the RDS, where he returned for one day to hand in his resignation from society. On the 26th of August 1921, the second Dáil met here in Mansion House, and Plunkett was elected Minister for Fine Arts. Plunkett was now almost 70, and with his new post, he had the task of developing art and culture of the new Ireland. According to Brian Kennedy, it was a non-cabinet post. The appointee, George Noble Plunkett, was eminently suited to the position. It is not known what plans Plunkett had for the post, but in the short time he held it, the only act of ministry was to organise the Dante Sexcentenary celebration. Plunkett arranged a programme of music and lectures in Irish, English and Italian to commemorate the 600th anniversary of the death of Dante Alighieri, the Italian poet most famous for his Divine Comedy. Plunkett had a particular interest in Dante. He was a member of the Dante Society in London and had read a paper before the society in 1903 entitled One of Dante's Illustrators, Pinelli. He would also, in his research of Botticelli, have studied the artist illustrations of the Divine Comedy. The Lord Mayor, bishops, clergy and ministers of state were present, and the street was thronged outside as Eamon de Valera welcomed and introduced each lecturer to the packed Mansion House. Plunkett read a paper on Dante and art, in which he discussed the inspiration the poet had given to the artists such as Botticelli and Da Vinci. Unfortunately, his time as Minister for Fine Arts did not last long. It was while attending the Dante celebrations that de Valera was told of the signing of the treaty. It's here on the 6th of December 1921. Count Plunkett stood against the treaty and was again imprisoned in Mountjoy and then the Curragh camp. The Department of Fine Arts was merged with the Department of Education, not to re-emerge for another 60 years. At his death in 1948, the national newspapers paid tribute to him, the Irish Times, the Irish Press and the Evening Herald announcing his death on the front page. Describing him as an Irish patriot, a great Irishman and a veteran of the national struggle, they also made reference to his many cultural achievements. The Evening Herald wrote that his appointment to the directorship of the National Museum in 1907 heralded a remarkable rise in the standard of that institution. The Irish Press described him as one of the most striking and many-sided figures of our time and a venerable figure in Irish public life, a man of the widest culture, a pioneer in the movement for rejuvenating the Irish language, and an uncompromising nationalist. Even the Irish Times, a conservative and union newspaper, portrayed him as a splendid linguist, an authority andante, and one of Dublin's well-known bibliophiles. In 2016, I took the opportunity of the approaching commemorations to make my own tribute to the Count and his son Joe, by designing a book of a selection of their poetry. It was printed in an edition of 50, in the workshop at my home and around the corner from Count Plunkett's early home in Palmerston Road. Selected poetry of Joseph Mary Plunkett and George Noble Plunkett is a collection of 22 poems set by hand using metal type and printed letterpress and has their own publication produced. It was exhibited in the Studio Gallery in Temple Bar in May 2016 and the Olivier Cornet Gallery that summer. Plunkett's life spanned a time of great upheaval in Irish history, from the rise and fall of Parnell through the 1916 Rising and the wars that followed, and he was involved in some way with all. He took an active part in the revivals of language, literature and culture, and through these he expressed his belief in an independent Ireland, beliefs he fought for in his political career, opposing the treaty and upholding the ideals of Pearse and his son Joe. He was a respected and well-known figure in both politics and the art world of early 20th century Ireland. However, like many once well-known personages, he has now been largely forgotten in contemporary times. Revision is needed, as he was involved in so many cultural revivals and political upheavals that an in-depth study of his experiences would not only deal with a very interesting man's life, but also provide an original insight into many of the societies and politics of the time.
Mary, you need a word to see us.